Hello everyone, my name is Danny Solomon, and this is going to be a short video about the Analogue Pocket. It's a great device, and probably the best way to relive your favorite handheld games from the 90s. This is mainly a focus on Nintendo, Sega, and TurboGrafx games, but you can also emulate with this device. The developers and the people who made this device from Analogue definitely let you use your device to the best of its ability and unlock its full potential from the get-go. It's definitely a device that I can recommend to anyone, but it does come with its drawbacks. Later on in this video, we will be unboxing the Analogue Pocket, and then we'll have a short comparison between the Analogue Pocket and the original hardware of the Game Boy Color and a modded Game Boy Color that I modded myself. It's going to be a great way to take a look at old hardware, new hardware, and how they compare. So please stay tuned and we will take a look at that right now. Okay everyone, so this is going to be an unboxing experience of the Analogue Pocket and a little bit of comparison between the Game Boy Color, the modded Game Boy Color, and the Analogue Pocket. So here we have the transparent red edition of the Analogue Pocket. A lot like an Apple device when it comes to unboxing, and as you can see, this is my very favorite. It's a great device. So as you can see, it's playing this game natively, but you can also play via emulation. So this is the Analogue Pocket. It obviously does also play Game Boy games. Now you may recognize this from back in the 90s. This is the original Pokemon Red from 1997, I believe, or 98. Now it will play on the Analogue Pocket, no problem. It's a great device. And obviously this is the best way to play this. But in order to really appreciate the greatness and of how this plays our retro games, we need to really take a look at the past. These games were definitely not experienced this way in the past. In a small history, or a small comparison, you have a Game Boy, original Game Boy game. You have a Game Boy Color game. And then you have Game Boy Advance. These were 3 separate generations of Game Boy game back in the day, made by Nintendo. And Analogue has created a device that can play all of these games, and then some, natively. So this device can play your games natively through the cartridge reader, as you can see here. And that's what makes this device so great. Because the Game Boy Color is not capable of doing this. The Game Boy Color can play Game Boy, only Game Boy, and Game Boy Color games. It's not compatible with the Game Boy Advance. You'd have to use a Game Boy Advance, which you can look up online, in order to play the Game Boy Advance games. Not to mention, you also have the ability of emulating consoles and arcade games directly on the device. Analogue and its developers definitely knew what it was doing when it came to this. And as you can see, this device has multiple facets, and it's got many benefits. Although it's expensive and pricey, it is the best way to relive the classics from the 90s. I would recommend it to anybody, and it's great. But nonetheless, we need to take a look at the Game Boy Color in order to understand why this device is so great. So this is the original Game Boy Color. The original Game Boy Color was a device that shocked everyone in the 90s. It played games handheld without the need of a console or television. So we used to have to play these without a light or in direct light so that you could see what was going on, because there was no backlights back in the day. Any 90s kid or 80s kid will understand the struggle of not being able to play this in the middle of the night because you had to have the lights off, or in the car while you were on a long trip. So this is the original Game Boy Color. And we take these exact same games and they can be played on the Analogue Pocket. Now this is a Game Boy Color that I modded. This is something that is now part of the retro gaming scene, where you take an old device, you reshell it, put a screen on it, a rechargeable battery as you can see, a new speaker, and you can experience these games like never before. Now what's the difference between playing it on this and playing it on the Analogue Pocket? Right? First off, the Analogue Pocket has a much bigger screen. I mean, it's definitely bigger, you can definitely tell. It's also higher resolution, and you can play more games on the Analogue Pocket than you can on the Game Boy Color, which is why I would recommend this instead of playing with one of these. Although this is the best way to relive the classics, as if it were on original hardware, you're only limited to the games that the Game Boy Color and Game Boy can play. You can't play Game Boy Advance, you can't play Game Gear games, you can't play anything else. So this is a great way to play the classics and experience them, but it doesn't compare to the versatility of what is the Analogue Pocket. Now, the Analogue Pocket, although it does play physical games the way they were meant to be played back in the 90s, the developers did unlock the FPGA core because it's got 2 cores, and you're able to emulate or play games as if they were all on the memory card. So you can play multiple games here. You don't have to have the cartridge necessarily, and it does take away from the novelty or the experience of playing games physically, like as you see on here. But with the memory card and with ROMs that are legally obtained, which are copies of games that you currently own, which I definitely own these games, you can experience all these games with a memory card instead of having to have cartridges, which is why this is the best of both worlds. You can play games physically and natively, and also emulate games at the same time. I mean, there's not really a comparison. And that's just the start. You can play Nintendo, Super Nintendo, you can play Sega Genesis, which are consoles from back in the day that were home consoles that had to be used on a television, as you can see here. You can definitely compare the size. The ergonomics are a little bit better. And although this is a great device, it costs around $250 market price. I modded it myself, and it's a great way to relive the classics. You're only limited to the original games that it can play. These Game Boy Advance games are not compatible. They don't fit, and you would have to retrofit them. You would have to retrofit a Game Boy Advance motherboard into a Game Boy Color in order to play these games, which is why this device was so revolutionary. You could play this handheld, but if you look at the quality of the screen, you look at the size and the ergonomics, the Analogue Pocket is definitely superior, which is why I love this device. It's a great device, and it's got a couple of drawbacks, but definitely more pros than cons. I recommend it to anybody. There's tutorials on how to add emulations and add ROM onto this, and it's the best of the best. In conclusion, the Analogue Pocket is a great device for gamers who want to relive their handheld classics and can afford the Analogue Pocket in the first place. I hope this video has educated you and anybody else who wants to know more about the Analogue Pocket, how it compares to the Game Boy Color, and why it's the best way to relive your favorite handheld games from the 90s. It is definitely a device I can recommend to anybody, especially beginners. Although it does come with some drawbacks, it is definitely the best way to relive the classics. It's got a great screen, it's the best way to play, it's comfortable, and it's very stylish. So thank you for tuning into this video, and I hope you have a great day.